Welcome to episode 130 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean text, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue Epicurus' letter to Pythocles, and we look at more phenomena of the sun and the moon. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
The wanings of the moon and its subsequent waxings might be due to the revolution of its own body, or equally well to successive conformations of the atmosphere, or again to the interposition of other bodies. They may be accounted for in all the ways in which phenomena on Earth invite us to such explanations of these phases, provided only one does not become enamored of the method of the single cause and groundlessly put the others out of court, without having considered what it is possible for a man to observe and what is not, and desiring therefore to observe what is impossible. Next, the moon may have her light from herself or from the sun. For on Earth too we see many things shining with their own, and many with reflected light. Nor is any celestial phenomenon against these explanations, if one always remembers the method of manifold causes and investigates hypotheses and explanations consistent with them, and does not look to inconsistent notions and emphasize them without cause, and so fall back in different ways on different occasions on the method of the single cause. The impression of a phase in the moon may be due to the variation of its parts, or to interposition, or to any one of many causes which might be observed, all in harmony with phenomena. For in the case of all celestial phenomena, this process of investigation must never be abandoned. For if one is in opposition to clear-seen facts, he can never have his part in true peace of mind. The eclipse of sun and moon may take place both owing to the extinction, as we see this effect is produced on Earth, or again by the interposition of some other bodies, either the Earth or some unseen body or something else of this sort. And in this way we must consider together the causes that suit with one another, and realize that it is not impossible that some should coincide at the same time. Next, the regularity of the periods of the heavenly bodies must be understood in the same way as such regularity is seen in some of the events that happen on Earth. And do not let the divine nature be introduced at any point into these considerations, but let it be preserved free from burdensome duties and in entire blessedness. For if this principle is not observed, the whole discussion of causes in celestial phenomena is in vain, as it has already been for certain persons who have not clung to the method of possible explanations, but have fallen back on the useless course of thinking that things could only happen in one way, and of rejecting all other ways in harmony with what is possible, being driven thus to what is inconceivable and being unable to compare earthly phenomena, which we must accept as indications. The successive changes in the length of nights and days may be due to the fact that the sun's movements above the earth become fast and then slow again, because he passes across regions of unequal length, or because he traverses some regions more quickly or more slowly, or again to the quicker or slower gathering of the fires that make the sun, as we observe occurs with some things on earth, with which we must be in harmony in speaking of celestial phenomena. But those who assume one cause fight against the evidence of phenomena and fail to ask whether it is possible for men to make such observations.
Martin, thank you for reading that this morning. Before we got started, I was joking with you guys that we might not have very much to talk about, but when I listen to you read it and look back at the text again, and then I think back about what we discussed last week as to the size of the sun and the issues there, it's almost as if this letter to Pythocles is discussed as being a letter about celestial phenomena and things that we see in the sky. But when I listen to it being read and I look at the different parts of it, it's almost as if he should have entitled it, I'm going to teach you how to think properly. And for that purpose, I'm going to use the sky as an example. Because every paragraph here, every passage references what's going on in the sky. But it's almost as if the emphasis is on how to think about what you see and not necessarily what the truth is about whether the sun or the moon shine with reflected light or whether they generate their own and so forth. So I do think we'll have plenty to talk about today here because, as Diogenes Laertius says, the Epicureans tended to combine their discussion of physics and epistemology. And I think that's what we're really seeing here, that physics is being used to illustrate the epistemology, and the epistemology is being used to show us how we come to better conclusions about the physics. So they work together. Okay, so with that as an introduction, welcome back to this week's episode, and we will tackle it from the very beginning because the first of the celestial observations that he talks about is basically the phases of the moon, the waxings and wanings of the moon, and what might account for that, and how we should approach it since we can't get there to put our hands on it or get very close to see it. We can only observe what we can observe, and we're going to use the example of the phases of the moon to talk about how to make good observations and think about our observations, because error comes not through the senses, through the seeing, but in our opinions about what our eyes report to us. That's where the error will reside, if there is any error, because the eyes are not processing the information. They're not telling us what we should conclude. They're just providing the raw data. So how do we assess the raw data about the waxing and wanings of the moon?
Well, Cassius, there's, I guess, a quote that I wanted to bring into this, and this comes from Christopher Hitchens, quite a polarizing figure, but he had something very specific he was saying about Democritus, Leucippus, and Epicurus, and he didn't talk about them much, but one of the things he said was, we don't have much to learn from what they thought about nature, but we have a lot to learn from how they thought. And I think probably, Cassius, you're going to take issue with the first part of that. But the second part of that is absolutely what you were saying there, which is the study of nature and the way Epicurus studies nature tells us a little bit about the natural world. But more than that, it tells us how we should think about the natural world, how we should approach it, and which line of evidence we should use. And it's that, to me, that is, I guess, the paramount interest in the letter to Pythocles and so much else of what was written by Epicurus and Lucretius about nature. You know, whether they were right or wrong, or whether some of what they proposed has been superseded by modern science, that is not the interesting story. There's interest to be had there, but the real interesting story was what you get from just about every paragraph that we're reading here, which is, how do we think we know what we know is true about nature? So that, to me, as you were saying, Cassius, I think that's the lens that we should explore this through, because it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's not surprising to me that Christopher Hitchens would say it in a much more articulate way than I would, since he was a very articulate person and very perceptive. I have a friend who sends me regularly clips of his attacks on religion that are all over YouTube. And he's very insightful and incisive in the way he approached everything that I've seen him discuss. And so, yes, I hate to even say that I have a quibble. You referenced that I would probably have some concern about it. And the concern I would have would only be the first part about what they thought, because the higher level of conclusion they came to, you can have more confidence in their conclusion than in sort of the more detailed stuff. The examples of all the different theories they had about lightning and bugs and all sorts of the details of magnetism and things that may or may not be correct. Absolutely right. We have far superseded the detailed level of knowledge they had. And so their particular speculations about those details are more of historical interest than they are anything else. The only quibble I'm having and that I would defend is their highest level conclusions about, as far as I'm concerned, the eternality of the universe as a whole, the fact that there's no supernatural realm outside the universe. I'm still willing to absolutely defend those sort of high level conclusions, because I think modern science continues to support them, and there's no reason to abandon those kind of things. But the details, for example, here about what's going on with the moon, we have a whole lot better information about optics and the distance to the moon and what's going on there, and we can explain all that without any need for the speculations or the alternate possibilities that he's talking about here. But to get back to the main point that you were so right on, the issue is that this is just one example. Looking at the moon in 200 BC is not much different than the way we look at things outside of our galaxy or whatever in 2022. We have limited information, and we're always going to have on certain objects, certain things, limited information, and we're going to have to decide what to do with the limited information that we have. And that's the important part of what he's showing us here, that if we have multiple explanations that can explain something, and if we don't have enough information to say which of those is right and which of those is wrong, then we should simply stop at that level and wait until we get more information before we adopt one pet theory and say that everybody else is ridiculous and only our own personal theory can be correct. If you do that, you've totally left the field of rational explanations of things and the rational study of nature, and you've become just an arbitrary nincompoop, or whatever words you might want to use to describe that. And what he says, provided only that one does not become enamored of the method of the single cause and groundlessly put the others out of court. Those kind of analogies there, I presume Bailey's done a good job of capturing the literal words. Become enamored of single cause. I mean, people they adopt a pet theory and they just can't see past it because it's their own. And it may be natural to do that. But if you let your emotional attachment to a single theory blind you to the evidence that it may not be the full explanation, then you're in trouble. And then the issue of groundlessly putting the others out of court. That's an analogy that's near to and dear to me. And that's what a court is. That's what so much of life is. It's a jury system or a judge who's looking at the facts and attempting to just rule fairly on the facts. And if we groundlessly put some evidence out of the picture just because it doesn't fit our pet theory, then again, we've departed from the path of rational judgment. Now you've got me wound up for sure today. Martin, I didn't have anything to say when we started, and now I'm just wound up. Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would mostly agree what you said, and maybe add one thing. So the method he suggests here, how to figure out what are the possibilities, is by analogy. No? So that things which are close to us, which we can take in our hands, look at, play around with. No? So we can come up to a single cause. So from these simple things we can do with them, things which are at our hand, we can sometimes come up with a single cause explanation, and we can rule out anything else. No? Then so that means we have a set of things which we know, so to say. No? So then by looking now what appears there up with phenomena which are far away from us, so we cannot actually handle it or look from a different perspective, then we can go by analogy. So what do we see with those where we know? And then, of course, there can be different ways which all present themselves in analogy, what we observe. And that is then the reason why we cannot choose a single one if all these analogies appear similarly valid.
Yeah, very good, Martin. You've used a word that should have jumped out already in our discussion, this analogy issue. Reasoning by analogy is so critical to Epicurus' thinking. It's discussed kind of at length in the Torquatus section of On Ends as well, if I recall correctly. And of course, when I say that, what comes to mind to question is, okay, so what is the opposite of reasoning by analogy? What is another method of reasoning other than through analogy?
Well, I think the obvious one is logic.
Or in addition to the logic is another option. The other option is just to imagine or fantasize or just pull it out of your, what did you say, Martin?
For the logic, we need to say more detail because
yes.
When we use analogies, we use logic too. So that means we would need to say more in detail, like we go to Plato. So he has this idea of those forms, no? And then he would apply these from the forms and then come up with logic from these forms. So with the assumption that his idea on the forms are correct, then he can or true, no? Then it would follow from the logic that then his explanation of the celestial phenomena is true. But there's no way in case of these Platonic forms to really establish any truth or relevance of his forms. So that means that method is invalid from the start.
Yeah, Martin, you're doing a very good job this morning. I'll let Joshua comment on that when I finish here. But yes, when you use analogy, you're also applying the analogies logically. You're not abandoning logic by looking to analogy. You're reasonably applying the evidence that we get through analogy to produce a potential conclusion. So it's not necessarily, we've had this discussion so many times, it's not necessarily the single word logic that is the bugaboo. It is a method that, starting with false principles, I think is something that's pretty close to what Torquatus was saying. Starting with something false, like Plato was doing in his forms, it doesn't matter how logically consistent you are in applying those forms and manipulating those forms through logical methods. If the forms themselves are a false basis to start with, you're not going to produce the kind of good reasoning that you would like to produce. Joshua, how about that point?
I think it's well stated. I actually have a tangent I want to run off on here, if you'll indulge me.
Absolutely, no problem.
And Martin kind of started me on this road with talking about Plato. And there's another guy that I kind of think is important for the story here, and that's Aristotle. And then from Plato and Aristotle, I want to talk a little bit about Dante, the Italian poet. And it has to do with how we interpret nature and how we approach the study of nature, which I think is, as I said, one of the principal points of reading the letter to Pythocles is to learn how to study nature. And Aristotle had I think, a completely different way of doing it. You know, with Epicurus, it's looking for those edge cases and the phenomena that we can't explain or that he thinks has been explained badly, and looking for a number of different potential explanations, and then sort of remaining, I guess, aloof from conclusions. That's not a universal statement. Certainly he made conclusions, but he wasn't willing to make conclusions about everything. You know, magnetism was something that he didn't think was resolvable in his time. So he didn't come to a conclusion about magnetism. And it's the same with things like eclipses and the motion of the heavenly bodies. And I think there's something very weird and alien about the natural world that Epicurus inhabits. It's a world where not all the answers can be known. And that is not, in my view, the same world that Plato and Aristotle lived in. They lived in a world where they thought that they could know the answers. And the problem is, if you think you can know the answers, but you really can't, given your limitations, then the answers you come up with are guaranteed to be bad. And with Aristotle in particular, there's this tendency, I think, and I'm not very well versed in Aristotle, but there's a tendency to approach nature as a system that subjects itself to classification and categorization. And so this, of course, is something we do today, you know, is classifying animals and plants and all that genetically and phylogenetically and all that. And I'm not saying that that's not a worthwhile pursuit, but what it turns into, particularly for later Christian theologians, is Aristotle starts with this idea that not only can you classify animals and all that, but you can actually build a hierarchy. This is something that the theory of evolution in particular has gotten away from. That image of, you know, the ape on all fours turning into a standing up man through several iterations is no longer current. But for Aristotle, this is sort of the way he approached nature, the idea that you could put insects at the bottom and then mammals, and that, you know, just build up this hierarchy until eventually you get to the gods, and then beyond the gods you get to the prime mover. And the reason I bring it up, because during the medieval period there was this paradigm in Christianity and in Christian theology, which has been called the Great Chain of Being. And I'm just going to read from Wikipedia here for you. The Great Chain of Being is a hierarchical structure of all matter in life thought by medieval Christianity to have been decreed by God. The chain begins with God and descends through angels, humans, animals, plants, and then at the very bottom you have minerals, something that's not even really alive. And I can't think of a better contrast for the way that Epicurus thought and for the way that he approached the study of nature. I can't think of a better contrast than this. And what it leads to ultimately, as I mentioned, you've got this Italian poet, Dante, who not only thought that there was a great chain of being, but he thought that you could sort of have a hierarchical structure that not only went up to God, it also goes down to Satan. And so you've got these circles of hell, and then at the very bottom you've got Satan himself. And of course, Epicurus, in Dante's schema, is in the sixth circle of hell, the circle of heresy. And so this is where you end up when you start from false assumptions and then just go wildly wrong, which you're probably destined to do if you start from false assumptions. So Epicurus's method, his method of just observing a phenomenon with the senses and then withholding judgment until you have better information, this is something that is so revolutionary in the ancient world and so thoroughly ignored for just thousands of years after him that it's really, really special. And it's so special that there's something really amazing about having these texts and having the ability to go through them, whether in their original languages or in translation. And so, I think we've all had that moment where maybe you started reading this letter and you thought, okay, this is fairly boring. But the story that it tells, I mean, I can't think of anything less boring than the story of how mankind approaches and studies his place in nature. So that was rather rambling, but I think that for me is what we take away from this.
Oh, that was excellent, Joshua. And let me tell you, that reminds me, I'm going to follow up on what you're saying, because there's an article that I regularly cite from 2014. You've already mentioned Christopher Hitchens. Let's stay in the firmament of current anti-religious commentators and go to Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has an article on edge.org from 2014 under the title, What Scientific Idea is Ready for Retirement? And he gives the answer to that question as essentialism. And I think it will be actually useful enough for me to read this one opening paragraph. And this is Richard Dawkins talking. Essentialism, what I've called the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, stems from Plato with his characteristically Greek geometer's view of things. For Plato, a circle or a right angle were ideal forms, definable mathematically, but never realized in practice. A circle drawn in the sand was an imperfect approximation to the ideal Platonic circle hanging in some abstract space. That works for geometric shapes like circles, but essentialism has been applied to living things. And Ernst Mayr blamed this for humanity's late discovery of evolution, as late as the 19th century. If, like Aristotle, you treat all flesh and blood rabbits as imperfect approximations to an ideal Platonic rabbit, it won't occur to you that rabbits might have evolved from a non-rabbit ancestor and might evolve into a non-rabbit descendant. If you think, following the dictionary definition of essentialism, that the essence of rabbitness is prior to the existence of rabbits, whatever prior to might mean, and that's nonsense in itself, evolution is not an idea that will spring readily to your mind, and you may resist when somebody else suggests it. And that's as far as I'll go in that article, but I think that's exactly the point that you just made in what you said earlier. And it's not just us talking today who think this is a very important point and who can trace it back and see the need to trace it back to even Plato and Aristotle. And it's just a shame that we can't get some of these people, when they talk about the history of the bad part of philosophy, to talk about Epicurus's reaction against it. But I guess that's our job to do to some extent, and those of us who promote Epicurean philosophy. But that's the point I think that's being raised here in this opening section of what we're discussing today, is that there is no such realm of perfect forms that everything else stems from. And you're saying that you thought Plato and Aristotle thought that you could know what these ultimate answers were. And that's their approach of a theistic universe, of a prime mover, where they might not know it, but if they can commune with their God closely enough, their God can one day reveal it to them. But in an Epicurean universe, there is no prime mover, there is no supernatural creator, there is no center of the universe, there is no absolute perspective that is the only one that is correct for everybody. And so that's why we got into this today. But I think that article that I just quoted and I'll put a link in the show notes where people can find it, but it's a good extension of what you've brought up there, Joshua, and from somebody who I think many people in our circles have a high degree of regard for Richard Dawkins and his work over the years. I don't know whether Richard Dawkins ever said that he was an Epicurean. I think some of these guys didn't. Christopher Hitchens at one point get quoted saying he was Epicurean in certain ways. I'm not sure what Dawkins's position is on Epicurus, but at any rate, where are we? We've probably hit the first paragraph hard enough. We've been talking about The first example was the waxings and wanings of the moon. And then the second example in line 95 is the issue of whether the moon and perhaps even the sun shine with reflected lights or whether they generate their own lights. And of course, as I was saying when we opened the podcast, that's the first sentence in this passage that's listed as number 95. But then you have that one sentence that brings up the topic, and then the rest of the discussion is the epistemological way that we should analyze it, about whether there's any phenomena that's against the explanation and how we should remember the method of manifold causes and don't look to inconsistent notions. This is such good epistemology. Nor is any celestial phenomena against these explanations if one always remembers the method of manifold causes and investigates hypotheses and explanations consistent with them, and does not look to inconsistent notions and emphasize them without cause, and so fall back in different ways on different occasions on the method of the single cause. It's almost like this method of the single cause is a phrase that deserves to be remembered.
One thing that I think is really interesting as we go through this is I think that Epicurus is thought of generally as being a very dogmatic philosopher, and I feel like that's a word that might ruffle some feathers, but I think that's nowhere less true than in his study of the phenomena of nature. He's not just going to tell you that the moon shines with its own light or shines with reflected light. He's just giving you, and the word here he uses is method. He's giving you a method, and it's for you to apply the method and to glean what you can from nature, given whatever tools you have at your disposal. Certainly, we have a lot more at our disposal than he had. And this is, I think, the main reason. I don't think our understanding of the universe would be a huge shock to him, because certainly he will have allowed for some of the discoveries that have since been made as potential explanations. He just didn't choose them as the only possible explanation. He wasn't content to just pick something and pretend that it was true, even though he couldn't demonstrate it to be true. And it's so interesting, so incredibly interesting. And it all comes back to the epistemology time and again.
I think you're completely right in what you just said. The interesting twist that you might put on it, that's cliche about the exception that proves the rule. You just made the point that he's not dogmatic about things that he doesn't have enough information to be dogmatic about. I suppose you could say, though, that what he is dogmatic about is that you better darn use his method of thinking, or else you're just never going to get it right. It's the method of thinking which tells you not to select a single cause when you don't have enough evidence. He's really, you could say, dogmatically taking the position that that's the right way to proceed. It is not correct to assert that all of this is explained through supernatural causes. He's saying it's not correct to just make up an explanation. He's saying it's not correct to just take your pet theory and go with that and forget everything else. What you need to do, and he's pressing that with force, whether that is the same as dogmatism or not, he's pressing with insistence the point that you should remember. He's pressing it paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Don't get wedded to a single cause unless you really have the evidence that supports that single cause. Keep an open mind to the possibility that you could be wrong if, in fact, you don't have enough evidence to be absolutely certain of your conclusion. But in presenting his conclusion, which is that this method is the right one, he's not wavering. He's not saying, well, I may be right or I may be wrong, and you may have a better way of doing it, but this is the way I do it. He's not going down that direction. He's saying this is the right way to approach this material.
And we have evidence, of course, in Lucretius and in Diogenes Laertius. This is the way Epicureans continued to think about these things, not just while Epicurus was alive, but for centuries after. This was a calling card for their approach to the study of nature. Mm-hmm. And I think Diogenes Laertius makes the interesting point that the Epicurean school, more than any other school, really sticks to its guns on a lot of these points, and it doesn't change a whole lot through the centuries. It's really, the method is good. It's good in the 4th century or the 3rd century BC, and it's good in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And it's good because it works. And so there's no reason to abandon something that works, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think the story really is the interesting story to be gleaned mm-hmm. from all of this.
And what you just said leads right into what I'm looking at for line 96. It leads right into the reason we're doing this. For in the case of all celestial phenomena, this process of investigation must never be abandoned. And why must it never be abandoned? For if one is in opposition to clear seen facts, he can never have his part in true peace of mind. The word that jumps out at me in modern discussions is cognitive dissonance. If you're looking at a set of facts out there and one of them is totally contradictory to the theory that you decided to adopt, then you're not going to have peace of mind. A reasonable person is not going to be able to have a settled confidence in his conclusion, because ultimately, if you're reasonable and you know what you're doing, you realize that you have groundlessly thrown out of court a witness who is trying to tell you something, and instead of incorporating what he's telling you into your conclusion, instead of coming to a conclusion that's consistent with all the evidence, you've just picked and choose. You've cherry-picked your evidence to produce the result that you're looking for. And even in saying that, that ought to jump out at people as being a ridiculous way of approaching life. You don't cherry-pick the evidence. You get all of the evidence and come up with a consistent whole from everything.
Yeah. So I want to talk. I want to
ahead.
talk a little bit about the very end of that sentence. He can never have his part in true peace of mind. This is something I think about just every once in a while. I had an English professor when I was in college, and he was really into science fiction. You know, he had the CV with all of the sort of great works of English literature, but his real passion was science fiction. And he always used to talk about a paradigm shift that happened when you change from a religious view of life in the world or universe to a science fiction view. And he said that in a medieval religious view, you have, you know, God is good, of course, whatever else he might be, and he's up there somewhere. So from up above, you have this source of, I guess, protection, a sense of safety, although of course he can punish you at any moment. And the real danger in your life comes from down below. And there was this persistent idea in medieval Europe that there was a physical place somewhere, what they called the Hellmouth, that there was a cave somewhere. This is essentially what Dante, the opening to his poems, the idea that if you have the right guide, you can physically go into the depths of hell and see the torture and the pain and the anguish and the suffering that's going on down there. And so that's right under your feet. You know, the entire time you're living, this future of horror, if you don't toe the right line, is right below you. And the point that my professor was fond of making was that with science and with science fiction, the paradigm shifts. We start to think of the earth not as being a source of subterranean gods of punishment and the afterlife and hell and all that. We start to think of the earth as being, in some sense, our home in the world. And the danger now comes not from down below, it comes from up above. It comes from, you know, alien invasions coming in the sky and all that. So there's a real shift here, I think, that happens between a religious view and then the view of, I guess, you know, we've all heard stories like the one I'm describing here about, what's that one, War of the Worlds? It's that
H.G.
kind
Wells.
of yeah, it's that kind of idea that, okay, we had this system. I used the term earlier, the great chain of being. The Latin phrase was, see if I can bring that up, scala naturae, the ladder of being. That comes from either Plato or Aristotle. So you've got this very quaint system. Everything has its place. This is the way life in medieval Europe was organized anyway. You had the king, and then you had the nobility, and then you had merchants, and then you had artisans, and then you had peasant farmers at the very bottom. And then certain underclass that you almost don't even speak of below that. And, you know, there was I think it was Alexander Pope. He wrote this 2 lines for a collar of the king's dog. So the dog had a collar, and then it had this little metal bit hanging off. And Alexander Pope was commissioned to write a couple of verses for the dog. And the verses said, I am His Highness's dog at Kew. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? So the idea is that everyone is someone else's dog until you get to the very top where there's God and he sits alone. And we get a taste of it in Lucian in some of his work on very, very early sort of prototypical science fiction. You get this shift where you start to think of the universe and nature as being something where you'll never have all the answers. And this, for a lot of people, causes anxiety and confusion. And so for Epicurus to arrive at the conclusion he arrives at here, which is that if you follow my method, if you have a study of nature that is grounded in not in just inventing certainties, but in withholding judgment about the phenomena of nature, this is a source of peace of mind. I guess is how I'm going to tie this back into reality. So there's a disconnect in the way that Epicurus sees the universe. There's a disconnect between that and the way that religious people see the universe, of course, but also the way that modern science fiction writers tend to see the universe as being something alien in the deepest sense of the word, and not just alien, but dangerous. I don't know that I have much more to say than that, but
just on that last particular point, I mean, you've got that reference in Diogenes of Oinoander to sort of a more cosmopolitan, that even strangers and people who haven't been here before, we sort of are concerned about their welfare as well. Just a very opening outlook towards other people. When Epicurus or Lucian, when they're discussing the fact that from their point of view, there are innumerable worlds in the universe, innumerable races of beings and so forth, it's not, in my mind, connected with a fear of that. There's no transition from, you need to realize there's an infinite number of planets in the universe that contain living beings, and some of them are going to be lesser and greater than you, and therefore you should be afraid of all these things. To my reading, there's no implication that this external universe that may be infinite in extent and eternal in time is anything to be afraid of. There's not that fear of the rest of the universe. And Epicurus is seeing us as part of that universe. We may be only one small part of it, but we're part of it ourselves. And it's not necessarily at all something to be afraid of, any more than the fact of death is anything to be afraid of, or to think that somebody's out there trying to punish you.
Let me give you, Cassius, and I know I'm just taking forever on this line of thinking. Let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. There is a problem, I guess, in the search for extraterrestrial life. It's called the Fermi paradox, and it arises when you think, how big space is, how many potential worlds there are that could be inhabited, how long we've been looking, which on a cosmic scale isn't that long, but we've basically been looking for extraterrestrial life for quite a while with quite advanced tools and equipment and technology, and yet we can't find a thing. And there's a solution to the Fermi paradox, is the dark forest theory. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The dark forest theory is the idea that there is life in the universe. It is widespread, but we haven't seen it because when a civilization gets far enough advanced and recognizes the danger that it's in, it hides. So that the reason we don't see signatures of life or we don't get radio signals from other worlds is because they don't want us to know that they exist, because the minute you light up in the dark forest, you become a target. This is I have friends who read this book. It's actually a trilogy, I think, and are just fascinated by the idea. And it persists because there's an element of danger to it. It presents a challenge to a person's peace of mind, and I think that this is something that Epicurus had a deep interest about, was securing peace of mind. Okay, I've spent.
No, that was good. And in fact, it needs to go further. I've never heard that terminology before. It makes a lot of sense to me. Martin, what do you think about the dark forest theory that he just talked about?
Yeah, I think we screwed up big time already. We sent out all kinds of signals already. So if there's something behind it, we will know sooner or later.
Yeah. I guess there's no need to belabor it, but since it's new to me, it strikes me as interesting to take that is what we see, and using the method of analogy about what we see here on Earth. That's what the dark forest naming would be. It's an analogy to what we have here, is that the living things in the forest that are big enough and bold enough or crazy enough to just walk through the forest and attract attention. So that's interesting. I've never heard that one.
I can't pronounce the author's name. I can spell it for you, Cixin space Liu. But this is the trilogy I'm talking about. You've got the three-body problem, the dark forest, and the last book is called Death's End. I had a number of friends who just went crazy for these books at one point. But that's the central problem. And it's compounded by the vastness of space and the difficulty of communicating across these vast distances. Diplomacy is something that you got to be able to constantly be talking to people. It's like the famous red phone at the White House during the Cold War. The idea that at a moment, the president of the United States can pick up a phone and be put right through to the premier of the Soviet Union. And you can't do that in space. It takes so long to get anything anywhere. And, like you said, Cassius, we're at risk of belaboring the point. But I'll put this in the show notes, the books I'm talking about.
Yes, we already have a thread. And in fact, I may even have a section of the forum already devoted to the issue of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And that's the kind of thing, sometimes I was reading in one of the articles this morning about somebody was saying that, well, Epicurus took the position that life itself is pleasure and just existing is pleasurable because he was such an ebullient, joyful personality that everything he did was fascinating to him and kind of childlike or whatever. And the guy was shooting down that as good reasoning, although I think it's probably to some extent true about Epicurus. But that's, maybe that is the point of why I bring it up, is because, gosh, I could spend hours or days, or you could devote a career to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, because it is such a fascinating subject for those who were so inclined. Okay, last point about all that would be that we got off into that because line 96 says that the person who abandons clear-seen facts will never have true peace of mind. The last point that I'll make about it at the moment is that, again, Epicurus was promoting a philosophy for regular people that he thought would apply to everybody. And you have many people in the world who can't devote their lives to the complete and full study of philosophy or extraterrestrial intelligence or any other particular topic, but virtually everybody needs a method of analyzing their existence and why they're here and where they're going and where they've been. And the Epicurean framework provides an ability to take into account all of this conflicting evidence and not leave you with just total cognitive dissonance. It provides a framework in which you can take all this disparate information and incorporate it into a worldview that just about anybody, as Cicero complained, it's not a very complicated position ultimately, that pleasure is the goal and that there's no supernatural realm and all you can really do in life is the best you can with the time that you have, and that you shouldn't follow made-up goals and made-up guides. You should follow the guide that nature gave you, which is feeling pleasure and pain. It's not all that complicated. But if you don't have a framework to put all this conflicting information in, you end up with constant cognitive dissonance, to use the psychology term. Okay, let's go to 97, and without even really talking about the eclipses. Joshua, you had stuff to say last week about eclipses. Do you have something specific on eclipses you'd like to add to where we are in 96?
Yeah, in the second paragraph of 96. First of all, I should say this. If by some strange chance you're just coming in at this episode and you want to know more about the size of the sun, you have to listen to our last episode. I think probably we all agree that was a good one, and
Yes.
hopefully clarified the position. That was episode 129. So I don't want to go on too long about this because we spent the entire episode last week talking about it, but there is one point in here. He says the eclipse of sun and moon may take place. He gives a number of different possible explanations for the effect that we see, as Epicurus, of course, would do. And one of the options he gives is that eclipses are caused by the interposition of some other bodies, either the Earth or some unseen body or something else of this sort. So this kind of dovetails with what I said last week, which was if the Earth is going to eclipse, or I got to think about this now. If the Earth is going to interpose between the sun and the moon, and that's what causes a lunar eclipse, then that tells us something about maybe what Epicurus was thinking about the size of the sun and the moon. Because otherwise, you would expect if the sun and the moon were relatively small and the Earth was enormous compared to them, then there'd be a lunar eclipse every night, you would think. And the same with the a solar eclipse. If what causes a solar eclipse is the moon interposing between the sun and the Earth, that again tells us something about the relative scale of the moon and the sun in relation to the Earth. So that's basically what I wanted to make.
Okay, and I see one other thing to say about section 96 before we move to 97. We continuously talk about the possibility of multiple causes because we don't have enough information to select only one. It's important to note what is said at the end of 96 here, though, because he says we must consider together the causes that suit with one another and realize that it is not impossible that some should coincide at the same time. In other words, it may be true that there are, in fact, multiple causes for what we're seeing. If you see a car go down the road in front of you, you don't know for sure whether that car is being driven by a gasoline engine or whether it's got an electric motor like a Tesla, or you could have steam engines and probably other types of engines. It's possible that there are more than one cause for the phenomena that you're observing. And so that's another reason. It's not just that you don't know which one is right. You should not even conclude that there's only one that is the explanation. So I think that is an additional point that goes with the what we've been talking about so far.
Speaking of cars, here's something we've all experienced, with the possible exception of Martin, of course, who doesn't drive. But I think we've all had the experience of sitting in a parked car, and then the car next to you starts to roll backwards slowly. They start to back up, and you feel for just a moment as if you are now rolling forward. And in that moment when you're rolling forward, I think the instinct for a lot of us is to slam on the brakes. And that's another moment where you've got two competing explanations for what's going on. Are you moving? Is the car next to you moving? There's this phenomena that in this case is quite tricky for the senses. So you've got two competing explanations for the same phenomena. And that's something very visceral, I think, that we've all, like I said, experienced.
Yeah, you're using the word visceral. Yes, it really is a very weird feeling for that moment where you're disconcerted, almost like maybe you spin yourself around as a top, and for that couple of seconds after you stop spinning, you're not sure which direction which way's up and how to stand up straight and so forth. I think there's a good analogy to that in Lucretius. I think it's book 4 of talking about ships looking at the shoreline and so forth. It's probably fairly the same thing, but it is a weird physical feeling that goes along with that. Okay, so let's go on to 97. What have we not talked? Martin?
Two more things. So coming back on this dark forest hypothesis, I'm not sure whether I missed it or not. Joshua, did you relate this to the Fermi paradox?
Yeah, this is a proposed solution to the Fermi paradox.
Okay, so because the Fermi paradox preceded, and then one of the solutions is this dark forest hypothesis. Okay, so you mentioned that already.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, like I said, I haven't read the books, or I really haven't read much about this, but I had friends at a particular period in time who were really drawn to this question. And I can distinctly remember I was camping one time, I think in Wyoming, and we had a beautiful, beautiful view of the stars. You know, there's no light pollution there, and absolutely gorgeous sight of really the whole Milky Way above us. And I just remember having conversations around the campfire about this particular subject because a book came out, a science fiction book came out that everyone I knew seemed to have been reading.
Okay,
I think the theory is older than that book, I think.
Yes. So you were referring to Stephen Lebb's book, correct?
No, it's a science fiction book by someone, like I said, I can't pronounce their name. I think they live in some East Asian country. And but it's a trilogy. It's the 3-body problem, the dark forest, and deaths, and are the 3 books.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that means there are multiple books on this one, but I think the origin is traceable back to Fermi, no?
Maybe, yeah. Certainly, it's a response to his paradox, and he might have come up with that as a solution. I guess I don't know.
No, he just posed a question, so he may have also given some solution, but so he posed this as a challenge to answer this, and there are many answers we give.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, then I have another one still on 96. I hope I didn't miss it when someone said this. So that at the end of 96, then there Epicurus explicitly mentions that we have may have only one cause, but we have at the same time multiple causes. No? So he doesn't explicitly he explicitly mentions this one as a possibility.
Yeah, and in fact, as I think about that sentence, if you've got an infinite and eternal universe, it's I hate to say it this way, but it's almost a certainty that you're going to have a sort of woven texture of antecedent causes that all combine and result in a certain effect. This is something that happens constantly around us. If I'm in my car parked on a road, that road was laid out, on a certain day, and then before that it was staked out by surveyors, and before that the property was owned by somebody else. So there's this endless stream of antecedent causes that results in just about everything that we see. And so it's not only likely that there are multiple causes for certain phenomena, but it seems to me to be very probable in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, especially these kind of practical things. But we should also keep in mind to make it feasible for science to actually make progress. So often we can identify a dominant cause and neglect whatever else may contribute.
Very good. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Okay, to move to 97, what is the main topic that we've not been discussing so far today, but which is never very far from the heart of Epicurus? And that is the issue of divinity and supernatural beings. Because he says, do not let the divine nature be introduced at any point into these considerations, but let it be preserved free from burdensome duties and entire blessedness. For if this principle is not observed, the whole discussion of causes and celestial phenomena is in vain, as it has already been for certain persons who have not clung to the method of possible explanations, but have fallen back on the useless course of thinking that things could only happen in one way, and of rejecting all other ways that are in harmony with what is possible, being driven thus to what is inconceivable, and being unable to compare earthly phenomena, which we must accept as indications. That's a poorly read version of it, but I can see an intensity in this particular point that we keep coming back to it over and over, that just because we don't understand something, don't jump to the conclusion that there are supernatural causes to it. And those of us who are always interested in discussing the Epicurean view of the gods, if you need to think about it because you think about gods, then realize that then you can answer the question by sticking to the presumption that real gods are not going to be assuming burdensome duties of their own. They're not going to be micromanaging anything like the stars flying through the sky if they're true divinities. True divinities don't do things like that. If you need a position on divinities, that's the position to take, and that will help you solve that concern. But if you don't come from that perspective of needing to look at it from the point of view of what is a real divinity, at least just understand that you don't need to just pick a single explanation when there is more than one that's possible, because that's a, quote, useless course of thinking that things can happen in only one way. And by doing that, you're, quote, driven thus to what is inconceivable. That's what people are doing who insist on just picking some speculative and without foundation view of supernatural causes to the things that are going in the sky. They're driven to things that really should be inconceivable for somebody who is thinking properly.
Yeah, then another thing to mention in this context, I'm not sure whether we can really see it here. I don't see it clearly written. If you refer something to arbitrary divine intervention, it's not an explanation at all, because then it doesn't explain anything. No? So that means we will not get any understanding if we just resign to it. Yeah, that was divine intervention.
Yes, I think that's an important point. And of course, what's the presumption there that you're making, Martin, is that we should want a real explanation. We should want real understanding, because that's the way we get peace of mind, because we can understand it for ourselves what's going on. That should be everybody's goal. But it's probably worth mentioning that not everybody sees it that way. Some people think that just blind faith and just taking things on authority, that they don't need to understand it for themselves. Let's just go to this expert, this priest, or just commune with God and have it handed down to us on tablets from Mount Sinai, as we discussed last week. That doesn't give us true peace of mind, because we're always going to have doubt. We always should have doubt about whether we are being imposed upon, whether we're being manipulated or misled by people who have their own agenda. At least my way of thinking, and I think we all agree on this, would be that we want to understand things for ourselves so we can be confident of the. Joshua, I know you have something.
I've been looking for this quote, which I want to introduce here. It comes from Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, invented the lightning rod. And It took me a minute to find it because people tend to leave this part out. He says, "It has pleased God in his goodness to mankind at length to discover to them the means of securing their habitations and other buildings from mischief by thunder and lightning." So he's introducing this new invention that he's come up with, and he's sort of riffing on this idea that traditionally lightning is seen to be something that comes from God, and now he's discovered a way to, as it were, steal the fire from the god, like Prometheus did, and to give to mankind this gift that will secure their buildings, including, as Lucretius points out, their temples and religious buildings from the lightning of the gods. There was some application to this quote when I was looking for it, and now I can't remember what it is. But
well, I could almost hear sort of not exactly sarcasm, but humor in that, in terms of it has pleased God to allow us to discover a remedy to this problem that God has created in the first place. In other words, I don't know if that's exactly it, but that's what I hear when I hear that.
I think there is a definite undercurrent of sarcasm to that entire passage, especially in the words "at length." God has at length discovered to us a way to secure our property.
It's kind of like, at length, after having cursed mankind with thousands of years of total pain and suffering and oppression, at length it pleased God to provide a solution to that in a certain way, which don't need to go into any particular method of how he did that to make people madder than they already would be. But it's to even say it is to reveal its craziness, to even say that. At length it pleased God to give us a relief from the cursed oppression that he put on us for all those thousands of years in front of us. Well, that just doesn't make sense.
I think that's the only way to read it. Ben Franklin was, of course, a deist and did not believe in a personal God. So I'm just putting that out there. I guess I was thinking on the lines of trying to figure out in your mind which cause was more appropriate to what we think is true. And what Ben Franklin seems to be doing here is ruling out the supernatural explanation as just being absurd in a sense.
Okay, well, if we move to 98 to begin to close for today, the last example that he gives is the changes in lengths of the night and the day. And he's saying that it could be related to the sun's movement, and maybe something becomes fast and then slow again, and that we can see examples of something like that on Earth. And I don't know that he gives another example here. Or maybe the second one is that because he passes across regions of unequal length. And so I guess there's at least two there possibilities. Or for the quicker or slowing gathering of the fires that make the sun. So maybe there's even three or more possibilities there. But as usual, I think what's important is the final part of that passage, because as we observe that we look to things on earth for the analogy. As we observe occurs with some things on earth, and which we must be in harmony in speaking of celestial phenomena. And here's the real punchline. But those who assume one cause fight against the evidence of phenomena and fail to ask whether it's possible for men to make such observations. I think that's an important aspect of the same analysis here. We need to be questioning these people who come to us with these assertions where they're just promoting one pet theory as the only answer. And we need to ask, is it even possible for these people to make the observations, to gather the evidence that would support their conclusion? In many cases, it's going to be, if we think about it rationally enough, we're going to realize that they are making claims which they have no possible way of having verified. When these people come to us and tell us that heaven is going to be an eternity of stroking those harps and singing songs and joyful praise of the Lord, is it possible that they know that? Have they been there? I would say, and of course, I think those questions answer themselves, but you ask, is it possible for these people who are making these assertions really to have observed what they're saying?
Yeah, he is just hammering this point home. His key interest here in the study of nature, maybe I shouldn't say his key interest, but he absolutely wants to get this point across, that if you're not using a method to observe nature and then sort out between different causes and then to withhold judgment finally about which cause is correct, if you're not doing that, you're just in the 4th or 3rd century, you're just making stuff up.
Yep. Okay, we're almost at the end of a normal length episode. I see, just glancing ahead to next week, we're going to turn to weather formations as opposed to the stars and the sun and the moon. But I suspect we're going to have the same epistemological and method of thinking points impressed on us over and over again. So we'll turn to those additional examples next week. So let's begin to wrap up for today. Martin, any thoughts that you've not introduced so far today, or anything else you'd like to say in conclusion?
No, I have nothing else.
Okay. Joshua.
I have another quote to introduce here as we begin to close. This comes from Cicero in his book on old age, which is a dialogue between Scipio and Cato the Elder. And it goes like this. He says, "And if I err in my belief that the souls of men are immortal, I gladly err, nor do I wish this error, which gives me pleasure, to be wrested from me while I live. But if, when dead, I am going to be without sensation, as some petty philosophers think, then I have no fear that these seers, when they are dead, will have the laugh on me." There's, of course, a bit of irony at the end, because Epicurus won't be alive when Cicero is dead to pass judgment on him. So this is sort of, I think, a big part of what Epicurus in his letter to Pythocles is dealing with. This is the intellectual world that he's living in, and he's pushing back in it the only way really that he knows how, which is to try and establish first principles to rule out the absurd and to approach the study of nature and the universe and the world that we live in with method. And he was the only major figure really from the ancient world who was willing to do that and willing to push it as far as he did, and I think deserves quite a lot of credit for that. But as DeWitt said, he was his fate was to be how did he say that? Anonymous when praised and named when condemned.
Right. And boy, that's an interesting quote from Cicero that you brought up. There's so much we could probably have a whole episode discussing the details of what he said there. You've got the issue of, there's no doubt about it that it gives people a certain pleasure to believe that they're going to go to heaven when they die. And so, Epicurus has said all pleasure is good. And in fact, Epicurus said in the letter to Menicius that it's better to believe in a false religion in a certain way rather than to fall prey to hard determinism and believe that nothing you can do can produce anything good for you. So it's almost as if Epicurus would certainly admit that some people get pleasure out of religion. And so therefore, what do we do about that? How do we analyze, well, it gives me pleasure, I'm going to pursue it. That I'm being an Epicurean, right, Joshua?
Yeah, a petty philosopher is what you're being.
A petty philosopher, that's right. So let's take a second. It's probably worth doing. What is an Epicurean answer to that position? If somebody comes to you and says, well, it gives me pleasure to think that I'm going to be going to heaven when I die. What is your response to that?
It's a difficult response because, of course, what I don't know is how convinced are you really? I'm sure there are some people who are absolutely convinced that what they're saying is true, but there's been rather notable stories, somewhat famous stories really, about Christian figures, religious figures like, for example, Mother Teresa, who have long periods of doubt in their lives. They have long stretches. I think they call it the dark night of the soul. Long stretches when they don't feel the presence of God. Now, I don't feel the presence of God ever, and that doesn't cause me any anxiety. But when you're a person who has sort of staked your claim in heaven, and then you suddenly don't feel the presence or influence of God, far from being a source of pleasure in your life, this becomes a source of huge anxiety and pain and suffering. And in Mother Teresa's, I think, diary or whatever that survived, that's just what it is. It's suffering and anxiety writ large. So it's possible that there are people who are so thoroughly convinced that they never have a moment of doubt in their lives. And to those people, I guess I just don't really have much to say. I suspect that that's not the case with most of them.
Right. It is certainly difficult in any individual case to dissect a particular person's life and their circumstances and to sort of talk through what's good and bad for them in particular. But on a more general level, I think we can give a fairly clear answer to how Epicurus himself might respond to that question, because he's a philosopher. He's not necessarily a life coach to some individual person in 300 BC. He is telling you in general how people in general should approach these problems. And I think at least one thing that you can say to such a person who says, a belief in heaven gives me pleasure, is to say to them, okay, it's giving you pleasure right now, but do you really have evidence that it is true? And what are you going to do when you're confronted by all the problems of life that cause you trouble? Are you going to simply take it on blind faith that you should stick with this belief regardless of what comes your way? Or are you going to look for methods of dealing with the problems that confront you? We try to deal with reality. You can say, I'm enjoying this ice cream that I am eating right now, but if I continue to eat that ice cream and I don't eventually stop and realize that there are reasons why I can't eat ice cream continuously for the rest of my life without stopping, I'm going to cause myself a tremendous amount of pain later on. And simple blind belief in religion about things that are promised to you without good evidence behind them, you're taking a risk, a strong risk, that if you're wrong about this, as Paul says in the New Testament, there is nobody more to be pitied than those who believe in eternal life, but who don't receive it. Do you remember that line, Joshua? Do you remember what I'm talking about there?
I don't remember that line. No.
Oh,
there is another. Was it Lactantius? There was a I guess a church father from antiquity who famously said that, it might have been Tertullian now that I think about it, famously said that his supreme joy would be to watch heretics and the godless and the mockers burn in hell. That was the idea that sitting in heaven and watching people being tortured for all time would be a source of a great relish to him because of what he had endured at the hands of these people, allegedly, during the course of his life. So,
okay, what I was looking for is 1 Corinthians 15:19, resurrection of the dead. 15:19 is, if our hope in Christ is for this life alone, we are to be pitied more than all men. Or in the King James Version, if in this life alone we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. The point being that if you live your life based on a promise that will never come true, of all people, you're the most miserable to have wasted your life on something that's absolutely without reward. You've put all of your stock in something that's going to happen in the future that will never happen to you. And so, of course, we can't solve all those problems in a podcast like this, but you just better be confident of the choices you make, because if you live your life in hope of a reward after you're dead and you don't get it, then of all men, those are the most pitiable, even in the words of Paul of Tarsus.
And the person he's describing in that sentence is Mother Teresa during the Dark Night of the Soul. And there's no, you can't be confident about your conclusions if you don't have good reasons for believing them. So I hate to speculate about other people's motives or what they're thinking or what they're feeling. But I just have to think all religious people at some point have to experience doubt. And that doubt, if you really have sort of banked your life on the promise of a return in the afterlife, that doubt really has to niggle at you. It's got to be a source of suffering in your life.
Well, I feel confident all of us on this podcast, we've all been surrounded by people who we love, we cherish, we have the greatest of regard for, who go through life with this belief, and they're not bad people. The truth about Mother Teresa herself is apparently very interesting and much to be debated, but we all know in our own families and our own lives people who are just as nice a people as they can possibly be, and they're not taking this position for any personal motive of oppression or manipulation of anybody else. They're totally blameless of any evil motive. They're just taking what they've been given and they're following it without questioning it. And that's, as Paul is saying here, it's not necessarily somebody to be punished for that. It's a pitiful situation That
the punishment is being wrong about it. And
yes.
Having put so much stock into it that when you lose, you either, there's the sunk cost fallacy. You keep throwing good money after bad, or you just pull out and start over. And I guess those are the options.
Yeah. And to me, this is why so much of Epicurean philosophy reads like some kind of an evidence or proper thinking textbook, because in many regards, it comes down to what are you going to base your conclusions on? Are you going to look for evidence to support your conclusions? What kind of evidence are you willing to take? Are you willing to just go with authority by just taking the position? Ultimately, I don't know, but John Smith, Joseph Smith, St. Paul said so, and that's all I need to know. They said so, I'm going to believe it. Is that the way you live your life in other areas? Is that the way you live your day-to-day life from the minute you get up in the morning to when you go to sleep at night? Do you just blindly do what everybody tells you to do? Why would you do that in the most important question of life about how you're going to be spending eternity, as Epicurus might say? The question of where you're going to be in eternity is extremely important, and you need to know, you need to have a position. Are you going to be basically gone after you die, or are you living your life for what's going to happen after you die? It's just extremely important material, and we can begin to get at it by discussing things as unusual as eclipses and the length of days and whether the sun and the moon reflect their light or not. Those are sort of test cases, or as Mr. Gellergode might say, shibboleths, or things that give us pause and ought to cause us to question the most important things that we think about. Now, we're really going on long here now. Any final thoughts, Joshua or Martin?
No, I think.
By the time we edit it, I think we'll have another good episode. Okay, well, thanks for your time today. We'll come back next week and discuss weather phenomena. And until then, we'll discuss these and other topics on EpicureanFriends.com. So thank you, and talk to you again soon.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, bye.